So this is the in-class activity for Chapter 14, the brain and cranial nerves. Part 1, Phineas Gage. So you can watch the Phineas Gage reenactment video and or read the Phineas Gage article on D2L. Both will be in the supplementary information folder. There's a short video that attempted a recreation of the story of Phineas Gage posted on D2L. There is also an article about Phineas Gage posted on D2L, Phineas Gage, Neuroscience's Most Famous Patient by Sam Keene. In short, Phineas Gage was a railroad construction foreman who is remembered for his improbable survival of an accident in which a large iron tamping rod was driven completely through his head, damaging much of his left frontal lobe. Throughout history, gains in knowledge about the brain have usually come from observing what happens when things go wrong. Answer the questions below about the Phineas Gage case and how it can help us to learn about brain function. Number 1. Of the structures that were discussed in the lecture, which one or ones are found in the frontal lobe? So here's a picture of the frontal lobe, and in the frontal lobe we have the primary motor cortex, which is located on the precentral gyrus, and that is going to be the wrinkle that sits right in front of the central gyrus, and it's shown in dark red on this image. You also have the premotor cortex, which is also known as the somatic motor association area, and that's shown in this medium red color here. Then you also have the prefrontal cortex, which is the very front of the frontal lobe. This is where executive thoughts and decisions take place. The premotor cortex is where you plan movements, and the motor cortex is where the neurons that stimulate specific muscles originate. You also have an area down here called Broca's area, which is responsible for the production of speech. There is also a small part of the gustatory cortex. You have to kind of lift up this edge of the frontal lobe and look underneath it, close to where the insula is. So the gustatory cortex is about here, so it's a little bit under the frontal lobe and part of the insula. And the gustatory cortex is responsible for your taste sensations. So nerves that come from the taste buds on your tongue, they pass first through the thalamus and then to the gustatory cortex with taste information. Number 2, what part or parts of the brain are responsible for emotion, and what is this collection of structures known as? So the limbic system is the name of the collection, and so the limbic system structures are responsible for emotion, motivation, learning, and memory. So the structures that belong to the limbic system include the hippocampus, which is shown in green in this image. The hippocampus is important for learning, so it's responsible for storing long-term memories and then retrieval of those episodic and factual memories. The amygdala, which is shown as this red ball here, plays a role in aggression, fear, and anxiety. The cingulate gyrus, which is shown in this brown color, links behavioral outcomes to emotion. So this is how you learn like the consequences of your behaviors and whether you had a good outcome or a bad outcome. The thalamus and the hypothalamus, so the thalamus is shown in purple, the hypothalamus is shown in blue. These also have specific areas that play a role in the limbic system. The entire thalamus and hypothalamus are not part of the limbic system, but parts of each one are. And the same thing is true of the basal nuclei. So the limbic system also includes what's known as the reward circuit, which is the circuit that makes you feel good when you do something. This is the circuit or pathway that a lot of drugs of abuse target. And there's a particular structure within the basal ganglia, which is shown in yellow, called the nucleus accumbens, which plays a very key role in the reward circuit, and this involves dopamine neurons. Number 3, explain a possible reason as to why Phineas Gage's personality changed after the accident. So originally, Gage's issues were thought to be solely because of the damage to the frontal lobe. So this picture shows the tamping iron. Basically, it went in underneath his left cheekbone, passed through the back of the orbit, and then up and out through the top of his skull. And so it was originally thought that all of his issues were due to the damage that occurred to the gray matter in the frontal lobe. But new studies have shown that the most important key damage was done to the white matter tracts. And so down here, these images are showing the different white matter tracts. And again, remember, white matter is myelinated axons. So this is going to represent areas in the brain that are carrying information from one place to another. So the axon is leaving one area and traveling to another with messages. So think of white matter tracts as like connecting roads. And so more recent research looking at scans of his skull have suggested that the largest part of damage was not necessarily to the gray matter, but to the white matter tracts that connect the frontal lobe to other areas of the brain. And so it's thought that Gage's personality change may ultimately have stemmed from the loss of connection, which means a loss of communication between his prefrontal cortex and his limbic system. And again, this picture down here shows several of the white matter tracts that are thought to have been damaged by the tamping iron. And this is a picture of Gage up here. He kept his tamping iron with him for the rest of his life. And so basically, the prefrontal cortex has your executive control, your rational decision-making centers, and normally your prefrontal cortex can override your limbic system urges. But because he lost these connections, he lost the ability to control his more basic emotions and behavioral drives, and it's thought that that's why his personality changed so dramatically. So 2 take-home messages. The prefrontal cortex is important for executive control and rational decision making. And the connections between brain areas is just as important as learning what the different brain areas do. It's also important to keep in mind that they have to have the ability to talk to each other as well. Number 4, what are the other 3 lobes of the cerebrum, and what specialized areas can be found in each? So we'll start with the parietal lobe, which is shown in this image as the blue area. The parietal lobe contains the primary somatosensory cortex, which is on the postcentral gyrus, and that's shown in dark blue here. This is the first location where all of your general sense information comes, like touch, proprioception, vibration, temperature, etc. Then you also have a somatosensory association area. You have part of Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is this entire little area here in purple. And so part of it is in the parietal lobe. And the Wernicke's area is involved in understanding speech as well as communication in general, like being able to read and write. The temporal lobe, which is shown in this yellowish color here, contains the primary auditory cortex, which is this lightest yellow color here. This is where all of your hearing information is going to go. And then you also have an auditory association area that processes that information. And then another part of Wernicke's area is also in the auditory cortex. You also have the olfactory cortex, which isn't shown in this picture, but runs about like right here. And that is where your smell information is going to send its signals. So it's going to go from the olfactory nerves in your nose to the olfactory cortex. And then you have the occipital lobe, which is shown in green. And this has the primary visual cortex shown in dark green, where your initial visual information will go to. And then the visual association area that will interpret that information. And then just note the rest of the gustatory cortex is in the insula, and the only way to see the insula is to lift up the bit of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and you can see the insula lying right underneath those 2 lobes. So part 2, what strokes teach us about brain function. Unfortunately, much of our knowledge about the brain has been gained by studying damage to the brain. So it's not ethical to go into a person's brain and mess it up just to see what part does what. But we've taken people who've had injuries and strokes and other types of brain damage, and by studying what area actually died or was damaged and what the effects are, is how we've determined a lot about what the different parts of the brain do. So just as Phineas Gage taught us about the function of the frontal lobe, studying stroke patients can also help us to understand how different brain functions are located in different areas. So number one, what is a stroke? How does a stroke differ from an epidural hemorrhage or a subdural hemorrhage? So a stroke is known as a cerebrovascular accident, or CVA, and it occurs when the blood supply is cut off to a particular region of the brain. There are two main types of strokes. You can have an ischemic stroke, which is due to a blood clot that blocks the blood flow, and so it completely cuts off neurons from being able to get oxygen and nutrients. And then there are hemorrhagic strokes, which occur due to a burst blood vessel, which then bleeds out into the brain. But if the blood vessel is leaking blood out into the brain, then again, the blood is not getting to the neurons that need the oxygen and nutrients. So a hemorrhagic stroke is due to a hemorrhage of a blood vessel. So a blood vessel breaks and the blood leaks into the brain tissue. And an ischemic stroke is when a blood clot stops the blood supply to an area of the brain. If you have an ischemic stroke and you get to the hospital soon enough, there are medicines that they give you right away that helps dissolve the clots, and the quicker you can restore blood flow to the area that was cut off, the more likely you are to regain some of that function, because not all of the neurons will have died yet. But again, time is of essence when dealing with strokes. And then here's another image that again just shows some of the different types of strokes, two different types of ischemic strokes. You can have a clot in an artery, or you can have a plaque, which is a buildup on the walls, which can also cut off blood supply. And then with hemorrhagic strokes, these can occur from like an aneurysm that bursts or just a torn artery. So the signs and symptoms of strokes differ depending on which blood vessel is involved and which area of the brain is subsequently affected. So you can have a wide range of stroke symptoms and outcomes, and it all depends on which specific vessel was affected. In contrast, both epidural and subdural hemorrhages involve bleeding on the outside of the brain around the dura mater. So strokes are cutting off blood flow sort of from the inside, so either through a clot or a vessel break, and epidural and subdural hemorrhages are bleeding around the outside of the brain where the dura mater is. So with an epidural hemorrhage, the blood builds up between the outer layer of the dura mater and the cranium, and these are usually caused by skull fractures or damage to meningeal arteries. And a subdural hemorrhage, the blood builds up between the two dura mater layers, or between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, so underneath the dura mater. The subdural hemorrhage is the most common type of these types of injuries, and it's usually caused by some type of traumatic brain injury. Both types are more dangerous when they involve arteries, which have a much higher pressure blood flow. However, bleeding from veins may be slow enough to go unnoticed until the pressures reach critical levels. So in those cases, people tend to ignore their symptoms or not think their symptoms are severe, and they may not seek help in enough time to actually reverse the damage. Epidural hematomas more often involve arteries, while subdural hematomas more often involve veins. So in a lot of pictures, you'll see the epidural hematomas colored red to represent arterial blood, and you'll see the subdural hemorrhages colored blue to represent venous blood. Some notable deaths that happen from these types of hemorrhages. So Dr. Robert Atkins of the Atkins diet, he slipped on ice, hit his head, and died from an epidural hematoma. Natasha Richardson, an actress, she had a skiing accident and also died from an epidural hematoma. Gary Coleman, the actor from Different Strokes, fell at home and hit his head and died 2 days later from an epidural hematoma. And in shaken baby syndrome, where parents or caretakers shake a baby and their head bounces all around in their skull, death usually or can occur from subdural hemorrhages. Case number 1. A 77-year-old woman was cooking in the kitchen when she collapsed onto the floor. Her daughter called an ambulance and the woman was taken to the emergency room. She had suffered a stroke and slowly regained consciousness over the next 2 days. However, when she woke up, she had the following signs and symptoms: paralysis of the right face and arm, loss of sensation to touch on the skin of the right face and arm, inability to answer questions, but the ability to understand what was said to her, ability to write down her thoughts more easily than to speak them. So number 2, given the signs and symptoms, narrow down the area or areas of the brain affected by the stroke. Be as specific as possible. So first of all, because she had right-sided motor and sensory deficits on the right side of her body, we can conclude that the stroke must have occurred on the left side of her brain. So remember, the left side controls the right side of the body and gets signals from the right side, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and gets signals from the left side. So the area deprived of blood flow would have needed to be close to the central sulcus, since it involved damage to both a motor area, because she had paralysis, and we know that the primary motor cortex is on the precentral gyrus, so the wrinkle that's right in front of the central sulcus. And we also know she must have had damage to a sensory area because she had numbness, and so that must have involved the primary somatosensory cortex on the postcentral gyrus. So we know that the damage must have been somewhere close to the central sulcus. Her inability to verbalize responses to questions and trouble speaking also suggests damage to Broca's area, which is the speech control center located in the left frontal cortex. She can still understand spoken words as well as write, so there is no damage to the auditory cortex or Wernicke's area. So she could still hear and she could still comprehend speech, and she was still able to write. So conclusion, we know the damage was to the left side. It affected the left motor cortex, it affected the left sensory cortex, and it affected the speech center known as Broca's area. So at the beginning of A&P2, you're going to learn a little bit more about how the body is, quote, mapped out on these areas of the brain. So there are specific areas in the sensory and motor cortex that map to different areas of the brain, like the fingers, the face, the feet, the shoulder, the elbow. And so, and again, you're going to get more about that in A&P2, but we know that she had problems on her like face and hands. So more than likely her stroke was in this area, so it covered part of the motor and sensory cortexes and Broca's area as well. Number 3, what is the name of her language disorder? So aphasia is the broad term that describes any disorder that affects the ability to speak coherently. And there are a lot of different types of aphasias, so they can be classified in multiple ways. Because this patient had damage to Broca's area because she couldn't speak, she most likely suffers from specifically Broca's aphasia. This is also called non-fluent aphasia or expressive aphasia. And with this type of aphasia, patients can understand speech and even communicate in writing, but they have trouble verbalizing or speaking aloud. Case number 2. An 81-year-old man, an avid reader, had a mild stroke from which he eventually recovered. He did have some residual signs and symptoms, however, such as a loss of vision on the right half of the visual field in each eye. And as a reminder, we went over this in the lecture, but each half of your visual field, so if you imagine looking straight ahead and there's a middle point, everything to the left of that point goes to the right side of the brain, and everything to the right of that point goes to the left side of the brain. So if you imagine these two images and notice, one is colored in red, one is colored in blue. If you look at the individual eyes, they both get a bit of the red and the blue, but because of the way the axons cross over at the optic chiasm, it turns out that everything that was from the blue side ends up on the left side of the brain, and everything that was on the right red side goes to the right side of the brain. So a loss of vision on the right half of his visual field means he wouldn't be able to see this apple, for example. He also had dyslexia, the inability to read, which greatly frustrated this man. Loss of sensation on the skin on the right side of the body. So number 4, why was this man unable to see the right half of his field of vision? Was there something wrong with his eyes? So again, remember that both eyes get a bit of the left and right visual fields, and then because of the way fibers cross at the optic chiasm, the entire right visual field goes to the left brain, the entire left visual field goes to the right brain. So if there were damage to his eyes, or even if just one of his eyes was damaged, then he would have trouble seeing both visual fields. So again, notice the eyes get information from both the left and the right visual field. So part of the red, part of the blue goes into both eyes. So if he had a problem that was at the level of his eye, his problems wouldn't be limited to just one visual field or the other. He would have trouble seeing both visual fields because each eye gets input from both visual fields. Instead, his symptoms indicate that he has damage to his left primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. So his damage is not at the level of his eyes, but rather at the level of his brain. So his eyes work normally, but damage to the left visual cortex prevents his brain from processing the signals that come in from each eye with information about the right visual field. So in essence, the pathway of information for the right visual field, his eyes are working, his nerves are crossing over, but the damage is back here in the occipital lobe, and the left side of the occipital lobe is not getting and processing those signals. This is what we refer to as cortical blindness. And so that means that the reason someone can't see something doesn't have to do with their eyes, but has to actually do with the cerebrum of the brain. Number 5, if this man could still see the left half of his visual field, why did he still have difficulty reading? Remember that the language processing centers, both Broca's area and Wernicke's area, are on the left side of the brain. So remember, the left side of the brain specializes in language and speech, and anything to do with language. So reading, all of that is processed on the left side of the brain. Wernicke's area plays a role in reading and the ability to comprehend written words. And the term dyslexia involves an entire range of disorders from mild to severe, involving the comprehension and use of written words. And dyslexia, there's no one part of the brain that's been identified to cause dyslexia. It seems to be a combination of different areas and the connections between them. We also could suspect that his visual association area may also be damaged, because that's also responsible for interpreting and recognizing objects like letters on a page. So you recognizing these as letters is actually your visual association area interpreting the data coming from your visual cortex. So the conclusion is this patient had damage to the left side of his brain. We know that it must have affected his left visual cortex because we know that he lost vision in his right field of vision, and possibly also his visual association cortex. We know it affected at least part of Wernicke's area. It didn't affect the whole thing because he didn't mention any problems with speech. And if you affect the entire Wernicke's area, you end up with a type of aphasia called Wernicke's aphasia, and he didn't have that. But we do know that at least part of his Wernicke's area must have been damaged. We also can surmise that at least a little bit of the left primary sensory cortex was damaged because he had numbness on the right side of his body. So the likely area of stroke for this patient would have been in this general area and covered part of the primary visual cortex, primary visual association area, a bit of Wernicke's area, and even a little bit of the primary somatosensory cortex. And now we will look at part 3, some miscellaneous questions. So number 1, identify the part or parts of the brain responsible for, and we'll just go through these one at a time, and I'll give you the answer after each one. So maintaining consciousness, damage results in an irreversible coma. So the answer to that would be the reticular formation, or you could have also said the reticular activating system, which is a subpart of the reticular formation. Next one, controlling visceral functions and coordinating autonomic reflexes, for example, heart rate and breathing rate. The answer to that one would be the medulla oblongata. Controlling respiration and relaying messages to and from the cerebellum. That would be the pons. Maintaining balance, equilibrium, and coordination of learned motor movements. That would be the cerebellum. Controlling visual reflexes. That would be the superior colliculus. Controlling auditory reflexes would be the inferior colliculus. Contains dopamine neurons that regulate activity in the basal nuclei would be the substantia nigra. Producing melatonin would be the pineal gland. Relays and filters incoming sensory information into the cortex would be the thalamus. Controls vital autonomic functions, secretes hormones, produces behavioral drives, regulates body temperature, subconsciously controls skeletal muscles, interfaces with the endocrine system, and controls circadian rhythms. The only thing that can do all of that is the hypothalamus. And then subconscious control of muscle tone and coordination of learned movement patterns would be the basal nuclei. Number 2, describe the meninges and the normal flow of CSF in the brain and spinal cord. If the reabsorption of CSF is blocked, what type of disorder will this cause, and how does the result depend on your age? And just a little side note, remember that you produce about 500 milliliters per day of CSF, and the holding capacity within the ventricles and subarachnoid space in the brain is only 150 milliliters. So you are constantly recycling CSF, making new CSF and getting rid of the old CSF. So the meninges are membranes that surround and protect the brain and spinal cord. The dura mater is the tough outermost layer. And in the cranial meninges, the cranial dura mater has 2 layers. There's the periosteal cranial dura, which is the part that's up against the bones of the skull. So think periosteum, right, is the lining of the bones. And then the inner layer is called the meningeal cranial dura. Then you have the arachnoid mater, which is the web-like middle layer. Underneath that, you have the subarachnoid space. Then you've got the pia mater, which is the inner layer that's anchored to the brain and spinal cord by astrocytes. CSF is produced by the ependymal cells in the choroid plexus, located in the brain ventricles. So you can find it in the 3rd ventricle, 4th ventricle, and the floors of the lateral ventricles. So the flow of CSF is as follows. From the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen into the 3rd ventricle, through the cerebral aqueduct into the 4th ventricle, from the 4th ventricle into the central canal of the spinal cord, and also from the 4th ventricle out into the subarachnoid space that completely surrounds both the brain and the spinal cord. The arachnoid granulations allow for the reabsorption of CSF back into the bloodstream via the superior sagittal sinus. Hydrocephalus is the condition caused by the buildup of CSF due to blockage of CSF flow or a problem with reabsorption of CSF. In children, this would result in an enlarged head because the cranial sutures are not yet completely formed. In adults, it's more dangerous because the buildup of CSF pushes inward and compresses the brain, which can cause damage. Number 3, each of the following areas is a part of the hypothalamus. Indicate the function of each and what a disorder involving that structure might look like. So the mammillary bodies actually are the part of the hypothalamus that plays a role in the limbic system. So they do play a key role in memory. They also control feeding reflexes. Damage to the mammillary bodies has been associated with a condition called Korsakoff syndrome. And in this syndrome, people lose the ability to form new memories, which is called a loss of interograde memory. And this is due to damage to the mammillary bodies from excessive alcohol use accompanied by thiamine deficiency, which is a deficiency of vitamin B1. The autonomic centers. These are the control center for the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system divisions, more in Chapter 16. So damage to this area could easily be life-threatening if the body can no longer regulate vital functions like heart rate. The paraventricular nucleus. This secretes the hormone oxytocin. And then next semester, you'll learn some other hormones that it secretes that regulate the pituitary gland, like ACTH, for example. So deficits in secretion of oxytocin could possibly underlie some social disorders, for example, autism. And in AMP2, we'll talk more about how both oxytocin and vasopressin play a role in social functions. However, damage to the PVN usually also plays a large role in dysregulation of the body's fluid content, which is called osmoregulation, as well as stress, because one of our stress responses, which again we'll talk about in AMP2, starts with the PVN. The preoptic area regulates body temperature, called thermoregulation, as well as our sleep. So the preoptic area is the site of our sleep switch that allows us to switch back and forth between awake and sleep. So damage to the preoptic area can cause sleep disruptions and prolonged insomnia. You can also lose the ability to regulate your core body temperature, which can become dangerous, for example, if you overheat or get too cold. The suprachiasmatic nucleus regulates the circadian rhythms. So damage to this area, this is also known as the body's body clock. And so this regulates a lot of timing within the body. So dysregulation of this area could interfere with the timing of hormone release and other processes. And the SCN also connects to the pineal gland and causes melatonin secretion, so that could be disrupted as well. The supraoptic nucleus secretes the hormone ADH, antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin. So deficits in ADH would result in the body being unable to maintain the correct fluid balance or osmoregulation. And it may also have some social implications, as I just mentioned as well. We know that oxytocin and vasopressin also play a role in our ability to socialize. Number 4, fill in the chart below on the cranial nerves. So for each cranial nerve, we're going to connect the number with the name, whether it's sensory, motor, or mixed, and then the key features to know from the lecture. So cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. It is sensory only, and it carries your smell information and synapses with the olfactory bulb. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. It is also sensory only, and it carries your visual information, and some of the axons will cross from one side to the other at the optic chiasm. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. This is a motor-only nerve, and it controls 4 of the extrinsic eye muscles. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve. This is also motor-only, and it controls 1 of the extrinsic eye muscles. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. This is a mixed nerve, both sensory and motor, and this one is involved in migraine pathophysiology. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve. This is motor only, and it controls another extrinsic eye muscle. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. This is also a mixed nerve, and inflammation of this nerve can cause a condition called Bell's palsy. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is a sensory-only nerve, and it carries hearing and equilibrium sensory information. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is a mixed nerve, and it innervates the tongue, the pharynx, and the carotid arteries. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. This is a mixed nerve, and it innervates a lot of the visceral organs, both in the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity, so it's very widely distributed, and vagal nerve stimulation is being used to treat many disorders. Number 11 is the accessory nerve, which is a motor-only nerve. This nerve controls the neck and upper back muscles. And cranial nerve number 12 is a hypoglossal nerve. This is a motor-only nerve that controls your tongue movements. And so this is the end of the Chapter 14 in class activity.